In the late 8th century, around the year 790 CE, a narrow, clinker-built ship cut through the cold waters of the North Sea. Its hull flexed with every wave. The wind carried the smell of salt, tar, wet wool, and human bodies packed tightly together. On its deck stood men who would later become legends in song and saga, yet in this moment they were not raiders or explorers. They were sailors facing a problem as old as humanity itself. They needed to relieve themselves, and there was nowhere to hide. This was the everyday reality aboard Viking longships during the height of the Viking Age, roughly from 793 to 1066 CE. These vessels were technological marvels for their time, capable of crossing open oceans and navigating shallow rivers. Yet they offered no enclosed cabins, no latrines, and no privacy. A longship was an open platform of wood, iron nails, and oars, exposed to wind, rain, and freezing spray. On long voyages, dozens of people lived, slept, ate, fought, and relieved themselves on the same narrow deck. The mystery is not that life aboard was unpleasant. The mystery is how Viking crews survived it without being wiped out by disease. Understanding how Vikings managed human waste on longships is not about curiosity alone. It touches the core of why these seafarers were able to travel farther, fight longer, and return home alive. In an era when dysentery, cholera, and intestinal infections could kill more reliably than any sword, sanitation was a matter of survival. The Vikings did not possess germ theory, microscopes, or disinfectants. Yet archaeological evidence, saga references, and comparative maritime history suggest that they developed practical, experience-based solutions that worked well enough to keep crews functional across weeks or even months at sea. To grasp this, one must first understand the nature of the ship itself. A Viking longship was long and narrow, often between 20 and 30 meters in length, with a shallow draft that allowed it to beach easily. There was no below-deck living space. The hull interior was filled with rowing benches, cargo, weapons, and supplies. At night, sailors slept on the deck under cloaks or simple tents of wool or sailcloth. During storms, waves washed directly over the sides. Anything loose could be soaked or swept away. In such an environment, waste management was dictated by two brutal realities. First, there was no place to store waste safely. Second, the sea itself was always present. The ocean was not only a threat, but also a solution. Historical sources never describe Viking toilets on ships, because none existed in the way a modern reader might imagine. Instead, waste disposal relied on immediacy and movement. When a crew member needed to relieve himself, he would move to the side of the ship or the stern, brace himself against the rail or an oar loom, and go directly into the sea. This act was dangerous in rough water. Falling overboard meant near certain death, especially in cold northern seas. As a result, it required discipline, coordination, and often assistance from shipmates. This method, crude as it sounds, had one crucial advantage. Waste was immediately removed from the living space. Unlike enclosed medieval ships centuries later, where waste could accumulate in bilges and fester, Viking longships had no stagnant interior where filth could collect. The constant motion of the ship and the washing action of waves kept surfaces relatively clean. Salt water, while not sterile, is hostile to many pathogens that thrive in warm, stagnant environments. Food remains and other refuse followed a similar logic. Fish guts, bones, and scraps were thrown overboard as soon as possible. Archaeological studies of Viking harbor sites show surprisingly low concentrations of ship-borne waste compared to later medieval ports. This suggests that longships arrived relatively clean, with most refuse disposed of at sea rather than stored on board. Another factor often overlooked is diet. Viking sailors did not eat the kinds of foods that rapidly spoil into dangerous waste. Their shipboard diet was dominated by dried fish, smoked meat, hard bread, and fermented dairy products like skyr. These foods produced less liquid waste and fewer pathogens than diets rich in fresh produce or contaminated water. Drinking water was carried in barrels and consumed carefully. When possible, crews preferred weak beer or fermented drinks, which were safer than untreated freshwater. Hygiene extended beyond waste disposal. Vikings were known, even by their enemies, for regular washing and grooming compared to other medieval peoples. Combs, tweezers, and washing bowls are common finds in Viking graves. While this reputation mostly refers to life on land, the cultural emphasis on cleanliness did not disappear at sea. Crew members rinsed hands and faces with seawater. Clothing was aired and dried whenever possible. These small habits reduced the spread of skin infections and parasites that could weaken a crew during long voyages. It is important to note that Viking ships rarely stayed at sea indefinitely. Voyages were planned around frequent landfalls. Crews beached their ships nightly when possible, cooking, resting, and relieving themselves on shore. This practice drastically reduced prolonged exposure to waste-related hazards. Open ocean crossings, such as voyages to Iceland or Greenland, were the exception rather than the rule, and even these were timed for favorable seasons. The absence of enclosed spaces aboard longships also limited airborne disease spread. There was no damp, dark interior where bacteria could multiply unchecked. Sunlight, wind, and salt spray acted as natural disinfectants. While this did not eliminate illness entirely, it reduced the catastrophic outbreaks that plagued later, more enclosed sailing vessels. This system was not elegant, and it was not comfortable. It demanded constant awareness, physical balance, and cooperation. Yet it worked. Viking crews were able to conduct raids, trade missions, and explorations across thousands of kilometers without being crippled by disease. Their success reshaped the political and cultural landscape of Europe, from the British Isles to the rivers of Eastern Europe. In this sense, waste management on Viking longships was not a trivial detail of daily life. It was a quiet foundation of Viking expansion. Without these practical solutions, the age of Viking exploration might have ended not in glory or defeat, but in sickness and silence on the open sea. By the early 9th century, as Viking ships pushed deeper into the rivers of Europe and farther across open seas, their success left physical traces behind. These traces, buried in harbor mud, riverbanks, and abandoned settlements, now provide crucial evidence for how Viking crews lived aboard their ships and how they avoided the deadly consequences of poor sanitation. Unlike later medieval navies, the Vikings left no manuals on shipboard hygiene. What we know comes from archaeology, environmental analysis, and careful reading of saga literature, where silence itself often speaks volumes. One of the most important archaeological sites for understanding Viking maritime life is Hedeby, a major trading center active from the 8th to the 11th century. Excavations there revealed layers of organic waste, but notably little evidence of prolonged ship-borne filth. The harbor sediments contain animal bones, plant remains, and traces of human activity, yet they lack the dense accumulations of human waste that would be expected if ships regularly carried and discharged waste while docked. This suggests that longships arrived relatively clean, having disposed of most waste at sea rather than in port. Similar patterns appear at Birka, another critical hub of Viking trade. Soil analysis around the waterfront shows controlled disposal areas on land, but minimal contamination from ships themselves. This reinforces the idea that Vikings treated waste as something to be removed immediately, not stored or tolerated within living spaces. The sea, not the harbor, was the primary dumping ground. The design of the longships supports this conclusion. The open deck, lack of internal compartments, and flexible hull meant there was nowhere for waste to accumulate unnoticed. Any filth left on board would quickly become unbearable, especially during long rowing sessions when crews sat shoulder to shoulder. The physical discomfort alone would have forced immediate action. In this sense, ship architecture acted as an enforcement mechanism, ensuring cleanliness through necessity. Saga literature, while often focused on heroism and violence, offers indirect insights. The Icelandic sagas describe life aboard ships in terms of sleeping arrangements, rowing shifts, storms, and conflicts, but they never mention latrines or waste storage. This absence is telling. Medieval writers were not shy about describing unpleasant details when they mattered to the story. The fact that waste is rarely mentioned suggests it was handled routinely and efficiently, not seen as a dramatic or problematic aspect of shipboard life. In one saga episode, a crew is described as spending days confined aboard ship during bad weather. The narrative emphasizes exhaustion and hunger, but not illness. If waste had accumulated on board, disease would have followed quickly, and such sickness would have been noteworthy. Its absence implies that even under prolonged confinement, crews maintained disposal practices that prevented contamination. Another layer of evidence comes from parasite analysis. Archaeologists have examined soil samples from Viking Age settlements and compared them with samples from later medieval ports. Viking sites show relatively low levels of intestinal parasite eggs associated with shipboard transmission. While parasites certainly existed in Viking populations, the data suggests they did not spread uncontrollably through maritime environments. This contrasts sharply with later periods, when enclosed ships became breeding grounds for disease. The Vikings also benefited from their sailing patterns. Longships were rarely at sea continuously for months. Even during major expeditions, crews hugged coastlines, navigated rivers, and made frequent landfalls. Each stop allowed for thorough cleaning, personal relief on shore, and the airing of clothing and bedding. This rhythm of movement broke potential chains of infection before they could take hold. Comparisons with other seafaring cultures highlight how unusual Viking practices were. Mediterranean ships of the same period often had deeper hulls and partial enclosures. Waste could collect in bilges, mixing with stagnant water and organic debris. These conditions encouraged bacterial growth. Written sources from later centuries describe outbreaks of dysentery and fever aboard such vessels, sometimes killing more sailors than combat. The Viking reliance on saltwater also played a role. Seawater was used to rinse decks, hands, and tools. Salt inhibits the growth of many microorganisms, and while it does not sterilize, it reduces bacterial loads. Combined with constant airflow and sunlight, this created an environment hostile to many pathogens. The Vikings did not know why this worked, but generations of experience taught them that certain habits kept crews healthy. Cultural attitudes reinforced these practices. Cleanliness was tied to honor and social standing in Viking society. A filthy, disease-ridden crew would reflect poorly on its leader. Successful voyages depended on maintaining strength and morale, and sickness undermined both. As a result, captains enforced discipline not only in rowing and fighting, but also in daily routines that kept the ship functional. It is also worth noting that Viking ships carried fewer people relative to their size than later warships. A typical longship might carry 40 to 60 men, each with defined rowing positions and responsibilities. This limited overcrowding reduced the intensity of waste-related risks. Every man knew where to sit, where to move, and when to act, minimizing chaos during necessary but dangerous moments along the rail. Taken together, the archaeological record and literary silence form a coherent picture. Viking waste management was simple, immediate, and brutally practical. It relied on the sea, the wind, and disciplined human behavior rather than technology. This system was not perfect, but it was effective enough to support centuries of maritime expansion. These practices mattered because they enabled endurance. A crew weakened by disease could not raid, trade, or explore. By solving the unglamorous problem of waste disposal, the the Vikings preserved their fighting strength and ensured that their ships remained tools of conquest rather than floating death traps. By the middle of the Viking Age, roughly between 850 and 950 CE, long-distance seafaring had become routine for Norse crews. Voyages to Ireland, the Frankish coast, Iceland, and even Greenland demanded weeks at sea and absolute coordination among everyone aboard. In these conditions, waste management was not an occasional inconvenience. It was part of a daily routine enforced by discipline, hierarchy, and shared risk. On a Viking longship, neglecting basic practices could endanger every life on board. Daily life followed a strict rhythm shaped by rowing shifts, navigation, weather, and light. At dawn, crews woke stiff and cold, often damp from sea spray or rain. The deck was cleared of sleeping cloaks and gear. Before rowing began in earnest, men relieved themselves quickly at the rail while the ship was stable and light was good. Doing so later, when fatigue set in or waves rose, was far more dangerous. Timing mattered, and experienced sailors understood this instinctively. Leadership played a crucial role. The ship's captain, often the owner or an experienced warrior, was responsible for maintaining order. This authority extended beyond combat decisions. He enforced routines that kept the ship functional. Waste disposal was one of these routines. Anyone who fouled the deck or hesitated too long risked punishment, not out of cruelty but necessity. A slippery deck could cause injury. Filth could spread sickness. In a storm, even a moment of disorder could cost lives. The act of relieving oneself over the side was itself a practiced skill. A sailor would brace his feet against the planks, grip the rail or an oar loom, and lean carefully outward. In heavy seas, another crew member might steady him. This cooperation reflects a deeper truth about Viking seamanship. Survival depended on mutual reliance. No one was truly alone on a longship, even in the most private of moments. Storms tested these systems brutally. During rough weather, waves broke over the deck, washing away debris but also increasing danger. In such conditions, crews often limited movement. If someone needed relief, it might wait until the ship could be turned slightly into the wind or until a lull in the waves. These decisions required judgment and restraint. Impatience could mean falling into freezing water, weighed down by wool and leather, with little chance of rescue. Despite these risks, Viking crews rarely abandoned their practices. The alternative, relieving oneself on deck or into containers, would have been catastrophic. Any stored waste would slosh, spill, and contaminate the ship. The Vikings understood through hard experience that immediacy was safer than containment. The sea was vast, and its currents carried danger away from the ship faster than any human effort could. Sanitation also intersected with morale. Long voyages were psychologically taxing. Men sat shoulder to shoulder, sharing cramped space, enduring hunger, cold, and fear. Allowing filth to accumulate would have magnified stress and conflict. Clean routines, even harsh ones, provided structure and a sense of control. In this way, waste management was as much about mental resilience as physical health. Another factor shaping these habits was the Viking relationship with land. Longships were designed to be beached easily. Crews often ended their day by pulling the ship ashore, turning it into a temporary shelter. On land, waste disposal became easier and safer. Latrine pits could be dug, water could be fetched, and the ship could be rinsed thoroughly. This nightly reset prevented long-term accumulation of contaminants. Even during longer open sea crossings, such as voyages to Iceland, crews planned for moments of relative calm to perform essential tasks. Navigation relied on sun, stars, birds, and sea color, but it also relied on a crew healthy enough to observe and respond. A sickened crew would miss signs, make mistakes, and drift off course. Sanitation was therefore indirectly tied to navigation and survival. It is also important to understand the limits of Viking success. They did get sick. Injuries became infected. Parasites existed. But the key difference lies in scale. They avoided the mass outbreaks that later plagued enclosed ships. Their open decks, constant airflow, and immediate waste disposal reduced transmission chains. Illness remained individual rather than systemic. This resilience shaped Viking reputation. Crews arrived on foreign shores not as weakened survivors, but as disciplined, capable fighters. Chroniclers from England and Francia described their sudden appearance with fear and awe. These accounts rarely mention sickness among the raiders, reinforcing the idea that Viking ships delivered men ready for battle, not incapacitated by their own living conditions. Waste management also influenced ship design continuity. Over centuries, longships retained their open structure despite advances elsewhere. The design worked. It balanced speed, flexibility, and health. Where other cultures experimented with enclosed decks and suffered consequences, the Vikings refined what experience had proven effective. In the end, the routines aboard a Viking longship were acts of constant vigilance. Every day demanded attention to small, unglamorous details. These details, repeated thousands of times across generations, allowed Norse seafarers to cross oceans and reshape history. They did not conquer the seas by ignoring the realities of the human body. They conquered them by confronting those realities directly, with discipline and shared responsibility. By the end of the Viking Age in the 11th century, the longship had carried Norse sailors across more of the known world than almost any other vessel of its time. From the icy waters off Greenland to the warm rivers of the Abbasid trade routes, these ships delivered crews that remained functional, disciplined, and combat-ready. Their success was not accidental. It was the result of systems that worked in practice, even without scientific understanding. Among these systems, the management of human waste aboard longships played a quiet but decisive role. Modern science helps explain why Viking methods were effective. Many of the most dangerous gastrointestinal diseases thrive in warm, enclosed, stagnant environments where waste contaminates water and surfaces. Viking longships provided the opposite conditions. Open decks meant constant airflow. Salt water washed surfaces repeatedly. Sunlight struck exposed planks, breaking down organic material. There was no bilge filled with stagnant water where bacteria could multiply unchecked. Waste entered the sea immediately, dispersing rapidly rather than lingering near the crew. The ocean itself functioned as a massive dilution system. While seawater is not sterile, it reduces pathogen concentration quickly, especially in cold northern waters. Modern studies of marine environments show that many human pathogens struggle to survive prolonged exposure to salinity, ultraviolet light, and low temperatures. The Vikings did not know these mechanisms, but generations of sailors observed the outcome. Crews that kept waste off the ship survived longer and returned stronger. Another scientific factor lies in hydration and diet. Viking sailors consumed limited fresh water, often preferring fermented drinks that were safer to store. Their food was dry, smoked, salted, or fermented, reducing the risk of bacterial growth. This diet produced less liquid waste and fewer opportunities for contamination. Combined with frequent landfalls, it created a pattern of exposure that limited the spread of disease. As maritime technology evolved in later centuries, many of these lessons were forgotten or ignored. Medieval and early modern ships grew larger and more enclosed. They carried more people for longer periods. Waste began to accumulate in latrines that drained into bilges or were emptied irregularly. Historical records from the Age of Sail describe outbreaks of dysentery, typhus, and scurvy that decimated crews. Ironically, ships became more technologically advanced while becoming more dangerous to live aboard. It was only in the modern era, with the introduction of proper ventilation, sanitation systems, and an understanding of disease transmission, that enclosed ships became safer than Viking longships had been 1,000 years earlier. In this sense, the Vikings had achieved a practical equilibrium long before science caught up. The long-term consequences of Viking sanitation practices extended beyond health. They influenced ship design philosophy. Speed, openness, and adaptability remained priorities in Northern European shipbuilding for centuries. Even when ships gained partial decks, sailors continued to value airflow and regular cleaning. The memory of what worked endured in tradition, even when the reasons were not fully understood. There is also a cultural lesson. Viking society valued practicality over comfort. Privacy was sacrificed for survival. Waste management was communal, visible, and regulated by shared norms. In a modern context, this may seem harsh, but in the environment they faced, it was rational. Their ships were not floating homes. They were tools of movement, war, and exploration. Everything aboard existed to serve that purpose. This approach shaped Viking identity. Crews learned discipline not through abstract rules, but through daily necessity. Every man understood that his actions affected the group. A moment of carelessness could mean sickness, injury, or death. This mindset carried over into battle, navigation, and settlement. The same discipline that kept a deck clean helped a crew hold formation under fire or survive a North Atlantic storm. The story of how Vikings managed human waste on Longships matters because it challenges common assumptions about the past. It is easy to imagine ancient people as dirty, careless, or ignorant. The reality is more complex. The Vikings were observant, adaptive, and brutally honest about human limitations. They built systems around what worked, not what sounded refined. Their success reshaped world history. Raids changed kingdoms. Trade routes connected distant cultures. Settlements altered the genetic and cultural map of Europe. None of this would have been possible if Viking crews had been crippled by disease before reaching their destinations. Sanitation, humble and uncelebrated, was one of the hidden pillars of their expansion. When we look back at the Viking Age, we often focus on swords, shields, and ships cutting through fog. Yet beneath those dramatic images lies a quieter truth. Survival depended on managing the most basic realities of the human body in the harshest environments imaginable. The Vikings did not conquer the seas by ignoring filth. They conquered them by removing it, immediately, relentlessly, and without sentiment. In that sense, their legacy is not only one of violence and exploration, but of practical intelligence. They understood that history is shaped not just by great battles, but by the daily decisions that keep people alive long enough to fight them.